Hey guys, and welcome back. I was doing a coaching session this morning and talking about Omaha 8 or better and the difficulty of deciding how to continuation bet, or C-bet as we often call it, post-flop in the game. And I realized that it would make a pretty good topic for a general theory discussion of why that might be. So I'm going to just show you guys a few examples today of how the equities work in a range versus range situation in Omaha 8, and we'll contrast that with the game Limit Hold'em, where things tend to be a lot further apart and the best hand tends to be further ahead. So take a look at this StudFlopDraw sim that I have run up here. Now, I've just chosen a Jack 6-2 rainbow board for all of these sims. And obviously, depending on the exact flop texture that you choose, it's going to change the equities from somewhere between a little bit to quite a lot in the range versus range situations. So it's a good exercise to go through and realize what board textures actually make a difference in this spot. But I chose one that seemed sort of generic or average, I suppose, for the purposes of this example discussion. And what we're looking at here are how the hot and cold equities work when we have a top 25% opening range here in hand 2 versus what I'd call like a standardish big blind defense range of somewhere between the 5th percentile down to bottom 60% or top 60%. And what we notice is that, no surprise, the top 25% range is a decent equity favorite, but it's not that high. It really isn't range versus range that shockingly high, 55.3% here on Jack 6 deuce. And it's going to be hard to have boards where you're just absolutely crushing as the preflop raiser in Omaha 8, range versus range. Of course, you'll have individual hands that are doing very well, but whenever you see the equities being this close together, you start to think that the complicated strategy of c-betting is going to be a little bit more complex. The closer equities run to 50-50, the more you will see a solver employ a very complex mixed strategy. Whenever the equities are further apart from each other, you'll see a much simpler strategy, that the solver will just be happy to range bet or bet 100% of the time with all of its hands in its range because it knows that its range is so strong that it can justify betting in the dark. So you will see players in Limit 08 routinely c-betting in these spots, and it doesn't look like it's that bad to do so. When you have 55+% equity, it's pretty reasonable to do this, and I would consider that to be around the threshold that I would consider for just basically playing a simplified strategy of just always bet. But now let's look at this simulation. What I've changed here is this would be more of a 3-bet pot situation. So I gave the first player top 30% and the second player top 20%, which is fairly realistic for 3-betting, in a 6-max type of environment pre. And now look at the equities. The top 20% range is only a very, very small favorite range versus range, 52%. And one of the reasons for that is because the hand 1 here, I gave them all possible hands. Some players will never 4-bet pre with like their premiums. You'll see aces or ace, deuce, even like slow play in these sort of situations pre. So what this means to me is that in a 3-bet pot, the hot and cold equities are going to run closer between the two ranges, and that would mean that we should routinely play a more complicated continuation bet strategy post-flop. We don't get to automatically just bet 100% of our hands in the dark, or we will start to run into problems with the bottom part of our range when our opponent has the top part of their range, and they'll get to check raise us quite often and make our life a little bit difficult. We've also made the pot quite large because it was already 3-bet, so it's not like we can just automatically fold a lot of the weak hands in our range. We're still going to have equity, and we're going to be in the unfavorable position of deciding how often to continue in a spot where our hand is quite weak. So remember that when you're playing in spots where the equities are running closer to each other, you need to think about not continuation betting in the dark and figuring out how to play a more complicated strategy that involves continuation betting primarily hands that are pushing equity. Obviously, in Omaha 8, we don't want to just completely turn our range face up. We would want to bet some weaker hands, but still choosing ones that maybe have good runouts, maybe have backdoor draws, have a little bit more equity overall, and still make our strategy relatively tough to play against. And just for another way to show how this works, now let's contrast this with Limit Hold'em. So here I just took, again, the same ranges, top 25% against top 5 to 60%, and now obviously in Hold'em it's going to be very flop dependent, but now look, I mean, we're just pushing way more equity with the best hand. So Hold'em is a fairly different game from Limit Omaha 8, and you can't employ the same strategies in both games and expect to get the same results. In Hold'em, it is very valid for the preflop raiser or the preflop aggressor to basically continuation bet in the dark. He is just kind of dominant in his range advantage, and we see that showing up here. And again, even in the quote-unquote 3-bet pot situation here, we see the top 20% hand versus the top 30% hand pushing over 56%. So these are more typical equity distributions in Hold'em, and the best hand is just much more likely to hold up, or the strongest range is much more likely to stay the strongest range, except on very specific board textures that favor the caller's range, which you guys can run as an exercise, or maybe I can take on for a future video. But typically, they are going to be around the middle high cards, where the preflop raiser has more sets and more two-pair type of combinations than the in-position player, even though he doesn't have as many overpairs. So like 7, 8, 10, for example, is a board that favors the caller of the 3-bet and not the 3-better himself. But typically that's not going to be the case. So I hope this makes sense. And when you're playing these limit flop games, realizing that your strategy for continuation betting has to be fairly different whether you're playing Limit Hold'em or Limit Omaha 8, because the equities are running very, very different in these two games, and it makes a big difference for your overall strategy. Think about what that might mean for how you choose to play individual hands, how you think about your strategy. Try to make it more complicated by recognizing what hands want to c-bet and which ones prefer maybe just to take a free card and wait till the turn, or play defensively with certain hands that are not particularly strong in Omaha 8. You do have to play a little bit more thoughtfully and a little bit more complicated in 08 when the equities are running close. So let me know what questions this raises for you. Let's talk about them in the comments, and thanks for watching. Hopefully this gave you a different idea about the way equities work in these games and c-betting strategies. It's definitely something that running these hands through solvers like I have for many years, you definitely get a good sense of what hands are trying to achieve what, and when you need to play a more complicated strategy versus the simple-minded strategy of just continuation bet in the dark, which many players employ. See you guys in the comments. Talk to you soon. Thanks.